everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be filming with you my June wrap up. Get yourself a drink or something like that because this is going to be a long one. During the month of June, I participated in Whatever You Want-a-thon hosted by Maddie over at Books and Browsing. I will leave her channel down below. But there were quite a few different things happening in June. First of all, June was Pride Month, so I tried to prioritize queer reads during this month, and I think I succeeded. There's also the Queer Lit Readathon, which was happening between, I believe it was the 6th and the 12th of June. And I also participated in the Brown Sisters Read-Along as a part of Queer Blackathon, which was hosted by Jessie by Bowties and Books. So lots of stuff happened this month, but I ended up reading a total of 17 books. So let's just get right into it. The first book that I picked up was Beach Read by Emily Henry. This was a adult contemporary romance novel. It took place in the summer on a beachside town, and it followed two main characters, January and Augustus, aka Gus. The two of them were rivals in college as creative writing students, and both have grown to become authors themselves. January writes romance, and Gus writes literary fiction. The two of them do not get along. This is an enemies to lovers situation, and when January's father unexpectedly dies and leaves her his beach house, she ends up becoming neighbors with Gus years after knowing each other in school, and they challenge each other to write in each other's genre for the summer. This is because neither really takes stock in the other's type of writing, and they want to prove each other wrong. So January tries to write the next great American novel, and Gus tries to write a romance. The interactions between these two characters was fantastic. I really enjoyed their dynamic and their initial frustration with each other, and then them learning about each other and growing. This book made me cry by the end of it, and that's what kind of bumped it up for me in terms of rating, and I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I listened to the audiobook of Cool for the Summer by Delia Adler. This was a YA contemporary novel taking place during the beginning of the main character's senior year. This followed our main character Laura as she goes through the processes of going through her senior year of high school and the ups and downs that comes with it. She's delighted to learn that her forever crush is suddenly interested in her and wants to date, but then she finds out that the girl that she spent the summer with and was in a relationship with has moved to her town and is starting at her school as well, and she has not told anybody about the summer or about her romantic feelings for this girl. This story was short and sweet and really great. I thought it had one of the most realistic depictions of a high school setting I've ever read. It had swearing, it had sex, it had people being kind of horrible to each other, but that's kind of what high school is. People are learning, people are growing, people are discovering their own identities, and it was a really great read. I really enjoyed it. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. Then next up, I read The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison. I read this as a buddy read with my friend Kayla, and I absolutely adored it. Hilariously enough, we both went into this thinking it was a fantasy romance, and it couldn't be anything but. This was definitely a epic fantasy, high fantasy, dealing in very much political court intrigue. This follows our main character Maya, who is half goblin, half elf, and is the 4th son of the Elven King, and is considered to be a disgrace to the family. So he lives in isolation outside of the court and has never lived inside the court's walls. Unexpectedly, when he's 18 years old, he learns that his father and his older brothers have all died in a mysterious aircraft crash, and he is now the Goblin Emperor. This follows Maya as he is learning to come to grips with his new role as Emperor of this world, in the middle of a world and a court that hates him purely because he's part goblin. And he is incredibly inexperienced. He doesn't know anything about this court. He doesn't really know how to play politics, and he has to learn as he goes. This is one of the most pure and heartwarmingly innocent characters I've ever read from, and I love him. He needs to be protected at all costs. But I really loved it. Despite it being dense in subject matter, it was a really fast read for me. I flew through it when I was reading it, and I absolutely adored it overall. It ended up giving easily a 5 out of 5 stars for me. Next up is the list of books that I read for Queer Lit Readathon. I ended up finishing 7 books for Queer Lit Readathon. The first book I picked up was actually my favorite book that I have read so far this year, and that is Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This is a retelling, reimagining of Dracula's Brides, told from the point of view of his first Constanta. It is told in a letter format as she is writing to Dracula about their relationship from the beginning to end, and it is just absolutely heartbreaking and one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read. This deals a lot with abuse, emotional and physical, and deals with the trauma related to it and the recovery thereafter. And it's one of the most well-examined discussions about abuse I've ever read in my life. This was a fantastic story. It was absolutely incredibly queer. It had a polyamorous relationship and many bisexual and pansexual characters, and it was just absolutely gorgeous. If anybody can read this book, please do, because it was just fantastic. I love vampire stories, and this was such a different take on a vampire story, but one that I absolutely couldn't put down. 5 out of 5 stars, in case anybody was wondering. Then I ended up reading Lumberjanes Volume 1 by Noelle Stevenson. This was an adorable queer graphic novel series, the first book. This tells the story of these 5 girls as they are at a summer camp for really tough girls. What is it called? Miss Quinzella Thisquin Pennyquill Thistle Crumpets Camp for hardcore lady types. It had a really great friendship between all the girls, and watching them interact at the summer camp that had things like magic and yetis and all kinds of other things was just hilarious and really fun to read from. The artwork was really cute. Like, I really loved the artwork in this. It's definitely a series that I will be continuing. I ended up giving this a 4 to 5 stars. Next up, I listened to the audiobook of Sordid, a transgender memoir by Jackson Bird. Jackson Bird is a YouTuber and a transgender man, and this told the story of basically his entire life, from when he was a child and all the way up until shortly after his transition. It details all the things leading up to his transition and his parents' reactions, his friends' reactions, his own questioning of his identity, and his own feelings about his place in the world. And I thought it was a really great take. It was narrated by Jackson himself, and I think it was also really funny and had a really great uplifting kind of message to it, and it was definitely one that I really enjoyed the experience of listening to. As you guys know, I haven't been writing my nonfiction, but I did really enjoy it, and I think anybody who is interested in transgender experiences should definitely give it a listen. Next up, I read Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe, and this book broke me. This book was phenomenal. This is a historical fiction young adult novel taking place in the 1950s in San Francisco in Chinatown during the height of the Red Scare. This follows Lily, who is a young Chinese American girl whose parents are not recent, but immigrants from China. She is going through her senior year of high school, and she's starting to question her sexual identity, especially when she meets her friend Kath and they decide to go and frequent the lesbian bar known as the Telegraph Club at night when nobody knows that they are going. This book does a lot with different ideas of the scares of communism and also queer LGBTQ rights in the 1950s. It dealt with club raids, it dealt with homophobia, obviously racism, and it was a really hard book to read, but it was definitely one that I am absolutely obsessed with and think everybody should read. I fell in love with Lily and Kath as characters. They were both just so adorable, and their friendship and their relationship was just so refreshingly positive and happy, and I loved seeing them come together and learn more about themselves, especially in the Telegraph Club, where they were meeting other women like them who have gone through many different things in their lives and who are out and proud queer women, and seeing them learn from them and take their cues from them was really interesting. It also had stories from Lily's parents and aunt as they came to America, and their stories of their adolescence that I really thought were interesting, and the story of how they met and stuff like that I thought added a lot of context as well to the story. But overall, I highly enjoyed it. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. You're going to see a trend here of a lot of very highly rated books. Next up, I read Girls of Storm and Shadow by Natasha Nan. This is the sequel to Girls of Paper and Fire, one of my favorite books of the last few years. This is a YA fantasy series taking place in a Malaysian-inspired fantasy world in which the world is divided up into 3 castes. There is the paper caste, which is made up of humans, the steel caste, which is made up of human half human, half demon type characters, and then there is the moon caste, which is made up of demons, and they are the highest class, nobility, and the entire world is run by the Demon King. This follows our main character Lay, as she is chosen to be one of the king's paper girls, which is basically becoming a concubine to the Demon King. Leia is terrified because her mother was chosen to be a paper girl and she never saw her again. And then Leia is actually chosen as a 9th extra paper girl, which is unexpected. This story is sapphic and an amazing fantasy story about these two girls who find themselves connecting in one of the most horrible situations you can imagine and deciding to bring down the regime from the inside. The sequel was just as good. I loved watching these two girls define their relationship and explore their relationship while also dealing with, again, trying to bring down this crazy, unfortunate situation. The fantasy and the magic elements are incredible. I love the way that the demons are represented and their like animalistic qualities to them, especially in the steel cast. I find them the most fascinating, where they're half human, half demon hybrids, and they've got different levels of demon in them and levels of human, and I think they're really interesting. The world is fantastic and the world building is really great. Overall, I can't get enough of this book. I love it so much. It is definitely, you need to check trigger warnings for this because there is a lot of trauma and scenes of sexual assault and recovery from trauma and different types of abuse, so really be careful before reading this, but highly recommend if you think you can handle those themes. One of the best fantasy series I've ever read in my life. This was definitely 5 out of 5 stars. I can't wait for the final book coming out, I think at the end of this year, or if not early next year. So excited. Next up, I read One Last Stop by Casey McQuestion. This is a kind of sci-fi-esque adult contemporary romance novel taking place in New York City. This follows August, who has just moved to New York City and has no fanciful ideas about any romantic lifestyle coming her way while living in the big city, until she ends up meeting this girl named Jane on the Q train to her school every morning for her commute. Jane is a biker looking punk rocker, like she steps straight out of the 70s, and the two click absolutely immediately, and Jane becomes the best part of August's commute. And then she finds out that Jane isn't actually just looking like she came from the 70s, but she is actually displaced in time and comes from the 70s herself, and she is trapped on the Q train, unable to get home. This follows August and Jane, as well as August's myriad of friends that she has made during her time in New York City, going through the motions of trying to figure out what has happened to Jane and how to get Jane home. This was a weird one. The science fiction kind element was definitely an odd take, but it was one that I really enjoyed reading from. Like, I just had to suspend my disbelief while reading about the sci-fi elements because it didn't quite make sense, but I had a good time while reading it. I really loved the character of Jane specifically. I thought she was super interesting, and her dealing with the notion that she is trapped in time and has been on this train for the last 45 years, and all that she has missed, especially as a queer Asian American woman in America, and seeing her like learn about everything that has happened over the years in America, and then also her grappling with like the ideas about seeing her family, all that kind of stuff. I loved her relationship with August. I thought it was really genuine and really sweet. I love that August was bisexual because I love bisexual representation in media because there's not a lot of it. The side characters are great. Maya, I wish like I actually knew her in real life and she could solve all my problems for me. Overall, I really enjoyed this and I'm giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I kind of struggled to read Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. This is a adult science fiction fantasy novel that's basically described as lesbian necromancers in space. And I honestly couldn't tell you what else happened in this book. This book was so difficult for me to read, just in general, because the writing style was very different to what I'm used to. It was very confusing, trying to figure out exactly what was happening plot-wise, but the vibes were all there. I loved Gideon as a narrator. I thought she was hilarious, and I thought she had like hilarious, like gives no shits type of attitude. What really helped me was I ended up finding the audiobook on Scribd, and I ended up listening along with my reading for the last half of the book, and that so helped me with my enjoyment of it. It was easier for me to follow with somebody else reading it with the proper like inflections and tones to their reading of it, that it helped me get the context that I was missing. And by the end of it, I was really enjoying it, so I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. Moving on, after the Queer Lit Readathon ended, I decided to take part in India and Steph's Brown Sisters Read Along, and I reread the entire Brown Sisters trilogy by Talia Hibbert. I started off with my reread of Get a Life, Chloe Brown. This is the first book in the Brown Sisters companion series, and it tells a story of Chloe Brown, who is a very loner-esque woman. Chloe is disabled. She deals with chronic pain and fibromyalgia, as well as a myriad of other health issues, and she owns her own website business and works from home. One day, Chloe ends up having a near-death experience and almost gets hit by a car, and she decides that she needs to get out of the rut that is her boring life, as her life flashed before her eyes and nothing really happened. So she decided to make her own Get a Life checklist of things that she wants to do before she dies, basically. Things that are adventurous. She ends up enlisting the help of her superintendent of her building, who's Redford Morgan. He is a starving artist working as a superintendent in his best friend's buildings, and he and Chloe do not get along at first. He thinks her very pretentious and snobby. She thinks he is incredibly rude. But he has a motorbike, and one of the things that Chloe wants to do before she dies is ride a motorbike. So that kind of starts their enemies to lovers type romance, and I just adore it. The disability representation, I think, was really well done in this instance, and I loved the talk of like classism and class struggle between Red and Chloe, both coming from very different backgrounds, and them working through it and learning to discuss it. I really love this book so much, I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Then next up, I read Take a Hint, Dani Brown during Jessie over at Bowties and Books' 48-hour queer blackathon, as one of the prompts was to read a book with a bisexual main character, and Dani Brown is bisexual. This is probably my favorite of the Brown Sisters trilogy. I absolutely adore both Dani and the love interest, Zafir. This tells the story of Dani Brown, who is a witchy PhD student who is working on her dissertation and teaching at her university. One of her best friends is Zafir, who is the security guard in her building, and the two of them get along incredibly well. Zafir is a hopeless romantic and a former professional rugby player who, after a family tragedy, has created his own nonprofit dealing with mental health in sports with young boys. He has anxiety, he loves romance novels, and he is just precious beyond belief. One day there is a fire drill that goes wrong, and Zafir ends up rescuing Dani from an elevator, carrying her out of the building, and a bunch of the students end up filming it, and it goes viral, everybody thinking that they are a couple. This ends up becoming a media circus, and they decide to go along with it and pretend to be dating in order to bring some more publicity to Zafir's nonprofit. Dani is trying to seduce Zafir at the same time as Zafir is trying to convince Dani that romance is a great thing, and the two of them are definitely polar opposites, but I just love them both so much. I think their relationship is fantastic. I love both of them individually so much, and they both care for their families so much. They both have such passion in their projects, and like Dani is a gender studies and literature student, which is exactly what I'd love to do, so I just see myself in Dani so much. And Zafir is just absolutely, like I said, precious beyond belief and needs to be protected at all costs. But this is my absolute favorite. If I could give it 10 out of 5 stars, I absolutely would. Last up, I ended up reading Act Your Age, Eve Brown. This book just came out in April, and I read it back in April. So this was a very recent reread. But this tells the story of the youngest of the Brown sisters, Eve, as she gets kicked out from her parents' house after another failed business attempt. In order to try and instill a sense of responsibility into her, she is told that she has 3 months to get out of the house. She has to get a job and support herself for at least a year before they will restart her trust fund. She ends up stumbling across the interviews for a chef's position at a small B&B called Castell Cottage, just outside of her town, which is run by Jacob. Jacob is entirely different to Eve. Eve is just sunshine personified, a super happy-go-lucky, eager to please young woman who is kind of flighty and kind of irresponsible, whereas Jacob is just a cynical, straight-laced, kind of seemingly rude young man who just wants his B&B to succeed. Jacob himself is autistic, and Eve along the way kind of discovers that she has her own autistic tendencies. And the two of them in their relationship just being such polar opposites is just incredible to watch. I love seeing their interactions. They're just hysterical together. And their love just blooming over time is absolutely adorable. And they just complement each other so much. I absolutely adore this, and I also gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Who's surprised? Next up, I read my book club pick for the month, which was Too Much Lit by Melissa Lukashenko. This is a adult literary fiction novel set in Australia. It is queer, it is indigenous, and it is a roller coaster of a ride. This book was really hard to read. It was definitely an interesting plotline. This follows the main character named Carrie, who is trying so hard to avoid two things, prison and her hometown, and she ends up having to go back to her hometown when she finds out that her grandfather is dying. She is forced to confront the problems of her past and the issues that she's got with her family. This deals a lot with intergenerational trauma stemming from abuse of Indigenous populations in Australia. It deals with familial trauma, abuse, many different other trigger warnings definitely need to be looked up for this. But as Carrie is dealing with her family and the repercussions of her being gone for a year, as well as the wake of her grandfather's death, her family is also trying to save their sacred ancestral land from being developed into a prison. This book was incredible. I really enjoyed it, especially the last 100 pages really picked up action-wise, and the story just flew by. It took me a bit longer to read because I'm not usually into literary fiction, and also the story is written in a kind of Australian dialect that it took me a little while to focus on. I had to really put all my concentration into understanding the language. But overall, I really enjoyed it. I think it was a really important read, and I think it was a really great story. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, me and my cousin decided to take up the daunting task of finally reading A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas. This I read in about 8 hours from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. the day after I got my second COVID shot, and I was just bedbound. It was perfect time to pick up this chonker and finally read it. I really enjoyed it. I love Nesta as a character. I've always loved Nesta as a character, and reading from her perspective after the traumas and the events of the main trilogy of A Court of Thorns and Roses was really interesting. Seeing her interact with Cassian and learning how to defend herself and to allow herself to recover from the trauma that she has experienced in her life was a really cathartic and really fulfilling experience in my mind. Her relationships with her new friends Emery and Gwyn was just absolutely amazing. I loved it so much. And the only thing that I really wish happened more was that there was more interactions between her and Feyre and her other sisters. Just seeing them interact a bit more would have been the icing on top of the cake for me. I loved that they didn't tackle her depression or her trauma as something that needed to or expected to be fixed purely with things like exercise and breathing and mind over matter kind of things. It really focused on her speaking with others who have experienced the same trauma as her and actually working through her own problems and speaking to somebody and very akin to therapy kind of aspects, which I really appreciated. Overall, I really enjoyed it. I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I ended up finishing 2 books that I started earlier on this year. First off, I finished reading These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. This is a Romeo and Juliet retelling taking place in 1926 Shanghai. This follows Juliet Kai and Roma Montikov, who are the heirs of 2 rival gangs in Shanghai, the White Flowers and the Scarlet Gang. After a massive betrayal and 4 years away, Juliet finally returns to the city of Shanghai, a new and changed and ruthless woman. She ends up having to be forced to work with Roma Montikov, the man who broke her heart and betrayed her, in order to discover the source of this plague that is roaming through the streets of Shanghai and seemingly only targeting gang members. This book was super slow for me to start off with, and it definitely doesn't have as much romance as you'd expect from a Romeo and Juliet retelling, but I did really enjoy it, especially the last half. I flew through it, and I really liked the mystery aspect of it, which means I'm definitely going to pick up the sequel, Our Violent Ends, when it comes out at the end of the year. Because of how long it took me to read it, and the kind of less romance than what I was expecting, I ended up only giving it a 3 out of 5 stars, but I did really enjoy the story, and I will continue reading the series. And then finally, the last book that I read during the month of June was A Prince on Paper by Alyssa Cole. I did a 24-hour readathon back in the beginning of April where I read every other book in the Reluctant Royal series by Alyssa Cole, and I got about 50 pages into A Prince on Paper before I stopped reading. I had other readathons to do during other months, and so I just finally got back to it at the end of last month. And boy, did I love it. I read it in one sitting, and I absolutely adored it. This tells the story of Naya and Johan, who are two side characters from A Princess in Theory and A Duke by Default. Naya is a very introverted and silent girl who would prefer to deal more with her online boyfriends in her video games than people in real life, after going through a trauma that you read about during A Princess in Theory. Johan is the stepson to the king of a small European town, and his younger brother is set to become king very soon, but his country is going through a referendum deciding on whether or not to abolish the monarchy. Johan, in order to protect his younger brother from the spotlight, decides to create this persona of a playboy, nonsensical, typical royal who loves the press and loves to have this attention, but it's not really who he really is. The two of them come together during a wedding of two characters from previous books, and they end up deciding to get into this fake engagement situation in order to distract the press from the referendum and to get some good press going for the royal family in Johan's family. This story was really great. I loved seeing the two of them come together, especially Naya learning to embrace her own personhood and her own sexuality outside of her family, which is what's been the focus of her life for her entire life. And Johan, seeing him be vulnerable with another human being was really great, and seeing his relationship with his family members change was fantastic. Overall, I loved it so much. I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this June wrap-up. If you've read any of the books that I read during June, let me know down in the comments below, or let me know the favorite book that you read during the month of June. And give this video a like if you did enjoy it, because it really does support my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I put out new bookish and writing videos every week, and I hope you guys have a lovely day. Bye-bye.